Hello and welcome to another Huns History Nest podcast, where history is enjoyed and salvaged forever.
Hello, Parcells. This webcast is on the peculiar institution, which is really another name for slavery. So, this is sort of the history of slavery in the United States of America. The place in which I want to begin our discussion on slavery is simply the defining of this topic. And when we think about slavery, there's always a few attributes here that we really need to look at and focus in on. First of all, in terms of being enslaved, what we're talking about here is someone is enslaved if they are deprived of the fundamental necessities of education. And we're not talking about reading and writing education alone. We're talking about education of the world around you. And to do this, you isolate individuals. And the plantations in the United States did this very thing, isolated individuals from the world around them. They were held against their will. Fear was used to keep people from running away. And there's two types of fear. There's physical as well as there's mental fear. And last and finally, of course, when it comes to slavery, people are deprived of their freedoms and natural human rights. The other thing that's intangible here is I want us to realize that, slavery does exist in the world in which we live today. Now, here is a just brief little idea of this. This is from January of this current year, 2012. And in this situation, we'll notice that slavery, the title of it, it's well and alive in the United States of America. And in this situation, there's 2,515 cases just in the United States alone. And these deal with the human trafficking. And many of them, as it says here, involve children. Now, when it comes to the peculiar institution, I want us to make sure that we understand that this is a term which would be utilized, the word peculiar, which means sort of unique or strange, different. And what we're talking about here is this is the term which was basically utilized in the South. They did not like to use the word slavery because slavery indicates all the evils of the institution of it, which goes all the way back to religious time. So, for this reason, many people religiously, because of religion, didn't want to refer to it. It goes back to the idea of ancient Egypt enslaving the Israelites and how brutal that type of behavior was. So, there's religious reasons to avoid the use of slavery. Also, the other reason is that the word slavery just quite simply it references everything that's bad, evil. And so Southerners didn't want that to relate to what they're doing down there. And number three relates to all of these reasons that slavery down in the South was relatively unique. There was a far different treatment and care of slaves in the South. The brutality, yes, it did exist, but there was treatment, there was care for individuals because these individuals were worth a tremendous amount of money. Mortality rates, you can look these up, are actually high for slaves, as well as the height, which means nutrition was decent, at least enough to not stunt growth. Plantations were far different than anything the world had ever seen. They were self-sufficient, and this self-sufficiency ultimately allowed for them to isolate, as we already said, isolate slaves from the world in which they lived. But more importantly, these places were like small towns in and of themselves. And in doing so, they encouraged slaves to have families. And as we'll see later, that there was actually more than 9 children per slave woman on average. We had an elimination of slave trade in the year 1808 as a result of the Constitutional Convention. So slave populations are going to grow by way of family. The family incentive is an important part of this because the use of the family can also be used as part of what we looked at already, that mental fear is you don't want your family broken up. And all of this goes to this idea of it being the peculiar institution. And a very good book by Professor Stamp will basically go into this much more.